to start the evening tonight, I thought I'd just share a memory that I had. I did an internship at Maxim Institute quite a while ago now. And then between then and starting back working at Maxim Institute, I actually did a year and a half working for one of the largest plastic packaging companies in New Zealand. My role was to sort of communicate between the customers and the freight and the factory, make sure that all the plastic packaging was getting printed right, all the designs and everything. And I remember the first time that I was brought onto site and given my orientation, and they sort of showed me around, they showed me the machines where everything was being printed, and they showed me the extruding machines where like they took these plastic balls and melted them down and extruded them out into these massive tubes that just sort of went into it was like a 4-story factory, and it just went up and up and up, and it was really, really cool. And then we turned the corner and we went into this enormous, enormous warehouse the size of your average like massive Countdown. And it was just row upon row upon row upon row of like massive reels of plastic that were all ready to go to their places. And I was just like, wow, this is incredible. And the guy who was doing the thing, he was like, yeah, and to think, all this stuff is still going to be around when we die. I just had this experience the other day when I was walking with my wife through the supermarket and just actually looking at all the products that I wasn't going to buy, but someone else was going to buy. You know, all the stuff on the shelves that is just, you know, surrounded with plastic or surrounded by glass or paper or whatever else it is, and thinking whatever I buy, like all the rest of this stuff is probably going to be bought by other people. And I did some research today because, you know, we're a research think tank. There are 651 mid to large size supermarkets in New Zealand. And so however much stuff is in that supermarket that I was walking through, that store is repeated 651 times around New Zealand. And it's just incredible the amount of stuff that we are producing and consuming. The conversation we're going to have tonight is basically looking at kind of the reality of what's going on, both the good and the tough stuff around the way that we're producing and consuming and what we're doing with it after we've consumed it. Part of the generation, and several of you in the room would be as well, that grew up watching Captain Planet and can almost not remember a time before you actually had to start sorting out your recycling from your waste. But obviously more and more we're facing questions of whether or not that sorting is actually worth the time doing it, and what's actually happening to recycling, and whether or not it's a good enough answer to the problems that we see around what we're consuming and producing. Tonight we've got 3 people who are here to speak to different areas of the issue. They've all got a lot of good stuff to say. I will invite up our first panellist, Sharon Humphreys, who is the Executive Director of Packaging New Zealand.
Hello.
Thank you for being with us tonight. Why do we need packaging?
Packaging, at the end of the day, is there simply to contain, protect, and communicate. So if you obviously need to contain your product, you need to protect it so that it gets to you in perfect condition, and you need to communicate what it is. So that is the basic when it comes to packaging. What we see nowadays is that packaging has become not just about what packaging is, but it's also about what packaging does. And that's really where we are seeing the innovation and the proliferation of packaging, because we're actually asking far more of our packaging nowadays than simply containment, protection and communication. We actually are looking for functionality, and so that's where we go from the realms of what packaging is to what packaging does.
So I think one of the things that has sort of come up, and we sent out a video along with the invitation to this, which was a piece by reporter Jidhan Casanata on Sunday, where he was looking at kind of what's happened since China has closed its doors to purchasing our products that need to be recycled. And it's kind of been one of the steps that has awakened people to kind of how much plastic we've got going on in our society. One of the questions that I've been talking to friends about is going, why do so many companies use plastic? It's obviously very cheap, and it obviously is, you can seal plastic quite easily, and it's not going to let air in, so it keeps food fresher. The next question I have, does so much of our packaging need to be plastic? Why can't it be glass, paper or bamboo?
I guess at the end of the day, plastic packaging is effective, efficient and economic. I mean, those qualities are the qualities that have seen the proliferation of plastic packaging. It's not simply about the fact that we now see loads and loads of packaging versus, well, we could put it into bamboo or we could put it into glass. Absolutely we can. And we still do see a great deal of different materials for packaging. But there is no doubt about it that when it comes to the amount of plastic packaging does actually outweigh all of those other materials. And that is because it's effective, it's efficient, and it's economic. So if you are looking at, again, how we live nowadays, what we want from packaging, what we want from our products, we want to be able to buy strawberries in the middle of winter. We don't grow strawberries in the middle of winter here. We need to transport them from the other side of the world. So if you're going to do that, you need packaging that's effective and it's efficient and it's economic. I mean, that's just the reality. Now, whether we actually need to have strawberries in the middle of winter is another conversation altogether. And so packaging is an enabler, and it enables us to get products. And so if you look at, in New Zealand, we are limited in what we can actually make here. And so a lot of our products are imported. And so when you're looking at imported products, you need good packaging, because if you don't have that good packaging, then you are wasting your products. Now, to take an extreme example in terms of value, perhaps, you look at our high-end electronics. We don't make them here in New Zealand. Half the time they're shipped from the other side of the globe. Well, you do not want those things arriving damaged. And so we're looking at the most effective way of getting those products across the world, through supply chains, through the demands of supply chains. And so, again, plastic packaging is extremely efficient, and that's why we have goods packaged in plastic.
So one of the things that when we had our little pre-conversation, one of the products that really gets me is those plastic seal packages that you buy for like $10 of shredded chicken, some ridiculously small amount of shredded chicken, like 300 grams, and it's got this big, plastic thing, and you can get the same product at the deli. And I sort of put to you, and I was kind of a little bit surprised at your answer. Why should supermarkets have those sealed packages? Why shouldn't we just have it in the deli and just get just what we want and have it in even just a plastic bag that can scrunch up to be so much smaller?
The reality is that if it's put in a plastic container, such as you're describing, it's shelf life. It lasts longer. It lasts longer than if it's in the deli and it's just simply left loose you can choose to go and buy it like that. I mean, this is where I think that there is a bit of misconception that, we don't have any choice. The supermarkets do offer choices. You don't have to buy it in a pre-packed container. You can indeed go to the deli and just say, I just want 4 slices of ham. I don't want to buy a container. So you do have that choice. But the reality is that packaged product is likely to last far longer than the unpackaged product. And that's because the packaging nowadays is incredibly good. The companies, our fast-moving consumer good companies, our food companies have gone to a great deal of investment to make sure that they can extend things like shelf life through very clever packaging. So it's not just the barrier qualities of the plastic itself, it's the gas flushing that they do to take the oxygen out of that package, so that's what obviously spoils your food. And so those investments have been made so that we have a choice, but also it means that those food products do last longer. When we look at the impact, and we're looking the environmental impact as well as the social impact as well as the economic impact of wasted food, it's actually far, far greater than that of the impact of the packaging. And that's where I think we have to have a balanced conversation about what the role of packaging actually is. Because you don't buy packaging. You don't go out to the supermarket and you don't buy packaging. You buy the product. You don't buy TV packaging. You buy a TV. The fact is, it's had to come in packaging to get it from wherever in the globe it's come from, because we don't make TVs over here. So you're not buying packaging. You are buying products. And at the end of the day, it is the products that we do not want to see wasted, because the impact of that is actually is quite horrendous on a global scale. We're already hearing lots and lots of stories about the impact of food waste. And those impacts go far beyond just tossing it in the bin, because when you're actually looking at the issues of food security across the globe, and there is tremendous food insecurity. In Australia, for example, are actually embarking on a massive project to look at this issue. And it's because they understand that the issue is far greater than just the food that's being tossed out, because it's, well, what's the impact on people who can't afford meals, who can't afford to feed their kids? What happens if you're having to make a choice between paying your rent and actually putting food on the table? And these are real concerns for some people. And it's very easy to dismiss if you're not in that situation. But when you are, then it is something that has a tremendous social impact. Now, those are the sorts of things where packaging actually has a huge role to play, because packaging does extend shelf life. It does preserve food.
One of the things that's coming up in some of these conversations that have sort of popped up in the last few months in media is the people who are now producing biodegradable plastics or compostable plastics. They're going, hey, these products are really great. They have pretty much the same. They feel, I've used them. They feel like plastic. They seal and all that sort of stuff like plastic. Why aren't more companies going, hey, this is a really good way of actually avoiding some of the negative externalities while still being able to deliver our products?
Because it's quite a simplistic substitution, is that? And actually, in reality, you're probably just substituting one problem for another when it comes to packaging waste. So that's not to say that this type of packaging doesn't have its place, because clearly it's not plastic. And if you're looking at it in that regard, then, hey, if that's how you particularly feel about a plastic product, then it's not plastic. But the reality is that many of these films, if you just think about it logically, are not going to have the barrier qualities that plastic has. So you don't have the shelf life that traditional plastic gives you. That's one of the issues. Some of the other issues are, what are we making this compostable plastic out of? Are we actually looking at substituting? Well, we're using fossil fuels, but are we then taking up valuable land to grow crops to make them into packaging? Is that actually a good outcome? So we've got to, it's not just about taking one thing and simply substituting it for another. There are some products, and Nestle in particular have done some quite a bit of work on this, because they looked, and they've said basically that they've done a whole study on a particular line of chocolate. And they've realised that their chocolate packaging is actually well over-engineered, because it does give great shelf life, but when they've done the studies, in actual fact, they just simply do not need that amount of shelf life. And so they're then looking at, well, actually, what do we do? What different materials can we use? Now, this work's happening up in Switzerland. It's not happening in downtown Auckland. So just so, we have to kind of manage where all of these things are happening. But again, it shows you that there is a place for looking at, well, do we need packaging to be as good as what it is? Is there opportunity for it to be perhaps not quite so well engineered? But then in other instances, you know what? That engineering is really incredibly important. One of the biggest issues with the biodegradable and the compostable materials is people don't understand the difference, and there are differences between biodegradable and compostable. And our end-of-life systems are not geared up to take this stuff. We do not have the infrastructure to collect it in a manner that means it's kept separated, because it's not good. The composters don't want it because it gets too contaminated with things that aren't compostable. The recyclers don't want it because it's not actually good in the recycling systems. It's very, very difficult for us to understand what are the differences between what's home compostable, what needs to go into an industrial facility. Do we have those industrial facilities? It's actually quite a complex problem.
We're very privileged to have Parul Sood from Waste Solutions at Auckland Council. So welcome, Parul.
Kia ora.
Can you tell us, as the person who's kind of in charge of this kind of thing, what happens to our waste when it goes from the roadside bin into that truck?
So firstly, there is no away. People think I'm going to put it there and it's going to go away. It doesn't go away. So you've got your recycling and you've got your rubbish. So I'll talk about the rubbish a little bit. Everything you put in your rubbish bin ends up in a landfill, which means it's gone, it's there, it's going to stay in that hole for a long time. And with your recycling, it goes to a facility in Onehunga and it gets sorted in piles of different commodities. And that then goes to overseas market to be sold. Part of it is retained in New Zealand, so we've got about 37% of it that remains here that can be recycled in New Zealand.
What can be recycled in New Zealand? What kinds of things do we throw away?
We do not throw anything away. What you carefully place in your recycling bin, washed, and may I also say, please do not put batteries in it. I don't know if you would have caught the 6 p.m. News. We're talking about recycling trucks catching fire. And the reason for that is because there was an Xbox console that somebody very carefully placed in the recycling bin, thinking it's going to go and get recycled, but that does not happen. So just being mindful of what you put in your recycling bin. So back to your question, glass is one big component that actually gets recycled in New Zealand, and the other one is your metal, so your tins and cans. And that's only 1% by weight of what you put in there. The cardboard and your paper has to go overseas at this point in time because we do not have the onshore processing facilities for it, which we are working on. And plastics goes overseas as well.
Why haven't we so far been working on actually trying to recycle what we make in New Zealand here?
And that's a great question, and I think we talked about China earlier, and what China has done has actually awakened the globe. It's actually gone, look, you guys take care of your own recycling in your own backyard. When people say, why are we sending our rubbish overseas? I don't quite agree with that. We were sending a commodity overseas, and what the recyclers were doing was saying, where will you get the best price for this commodity? We sell meat overseas and we sell wine overseas. We sell a lot of things overseas. So again, on that same thing, if you think of waste as a resource, you think of recycling as a resource, it has a commodity price. So what people did was they said, okay, here's the material. This is the quality of the material. Who's up for buying it? So when it goes overseas, people buy that product. So China has gone, if it's got this amount of contamination, we're not touching it. And they've actually forced the market and a lot of the countries to think, you need to think about this in your own backyard. So that's the reason why we need to think of it on our own backyard, which may not just be New Zealand. We could think of it as the Pacific or with Australia. What can we do in this part of the world while we talk about our recycling and deal with it?
When you think about an average landfill bin, what are the components in that bin, and what would you say would be the best thing to do to try and minimize what is going into landfill?
So if you think of your landfill bin or bag that you might have at the moment, there is a whole lot of stuff that's organic. That's your food scraps. That if you don't have a compost bin at the backyard is what you're putting in your bin. So that's about 40%. You still have recycling in there as well. So you're putting out, I think, about 10 or 15% of recycling that can go into your recycling bin. And then there's that bit that we don't have a solution for. So it could be the packaging that we can't collect in the recycling systems that council has, plastic bags, for example, but they may be at the shops close to you. So think about what other options exist for you to actually recycle that, but we may not have solutions for. So you could get rid of the 40% of food scraps, or organics, as we call it, and also that recycling, the 10 or 15% recycling that's wrongly placed in your rubbish bin.
So for people who don't have a backyard and maybe can't do a composting system, I know that there's certain suburbs, there's sort of private enterprises that are popping up doing things called like bokashi bins and food scraps bins. Are there any plans for the Auckland Council to start actually doing that on a wider scale?
Yep, so we do have a food scraps collection coming to town. So we've already started the collection in Papakura. If any of you live in Papakura, there is the 3-bin collection model that's going on there. So you've got your recycling, your rubbish bin, and you've got a 23-liter, a small bin for your food scraps as well. So that is something that's planned for the city, for the urban parts of Auckland as well. But we do recommend people home composting, as that's probably the best option in terms of dealing with it on site, and you've got the ability to feed that material onto your garden as well, if you've got one.
I mentioned before with Sharon about the just basically compostable plastics and the idea behind, hey, what if we could actually produce a packaging material for a number of, it might not have exactly the same barrier properties, but for a number of uses like replacing plastic plates or actually creating a plastic that had a number of the same sort of qualities as normal plastic, but we could actually just break it down into almost nothing at the end of it. What would be the barrier to basically, if tomorrow I become Prime Minister and I say, well, the first thing I'm going to do is make every single piece of plastic in New Zealand compostable, would the council be like in a position where it could actually process that?
I would say to you, you need to rethink that. You becoming the Prime Minister? Yeah. Not sure about that. I think you need to think of it in a bit of more of a holistic systems manner. And we were talking about this earlier. I was talking about this to Sharon. I guess we are at the end of the chain in terms of receiving the material and then having to look, how do we recycle it or reuse it or put it to good use? If a product manufacturer is thinking of changing their packaging type, they need to think of what are the systems that exist in the city that can actually take that product. So you may have a compostable packaging type, but if there's nowhere for it to go, or if there's no system for it to collect, it's going to be of no use. It will confuse your recycling collection system that you've got, and it'll end up in the landfill. So there is no merit in doing that unless and until that product manufacturer has thought it through, has said, okay, and here's my plug for product stewardship, to go, I take responsibility for that packaging. I will collect it back from you. So if I'm selling my TV and that, I'll take it back, I will recycle it. I've got a system to do it, great. But if it's expecting the external people to do it, it's not going to work. So I think it has to be that ownership of that product manufacturer to think of it in totality.
The question I have is just around e-waste. So that Xbox, where should it have gone? I think it's a very nice idea that companies would sell you a product and also say, and when you're done with it in 30 years, please bring it back. I think that just the realities of the fact that, we move cities, places close down, that not necessarily super realistic. And we do expect that the council probably is the source of responsible reuse or responsible disposal. That we can kind of trust the council to do that or provide a mechanism to do that. And so what should we be doing with batteries? What should we be doing with e-waste? And what are the constraints around that?
I had to answer this question about 3 times today, but that's okay. It was, if you've got an Xbox which is in good condition, some of them might be, I always say think about your family you may be able to give it to. But if that's not the case, think of charity shops that can sell it on your behalf. If that's not the case and it's actually defunct, it doesn't work, you can actually place it in your inorganic collections, the things that happen once a year. But if not, you also have e-waste recyclers that can actually take that electronic waste and recycle it properly. With the product stewardship scheme that I was talking about, it's not about taking the same product to the same vendor. The way it works overseas is they might have a slight fee when you buy that product, which is then in the system to actually recycle it, which we don't have here. So it's actually building the cost of recycling when you actually purchase the product to then enable the system to recycle it.
So the last but definitely not least panelist we have is Kristy Lorson, who is the founder of Earth Savvy and also the person who came up with the Zero Waste in New Zealand Facebook page.
Hi.
You've got quite a cool story. And so my first question is just, what was your motivation for pursuing a zero waste lifestyle? And first of all, I guess, what does zero waste mean to you?
Zero waste means producing as little waste as possible, extending that to recycling as well. So trying to put as few objects into our recycling and our rubbish bins as we possibly can. In terms of how did I get to where I am at the moment, I think I've always considered myself to be an environmentally minded person. I've always cared about the environment. I think I back in the day, I didn't quite understand what that really meant in terms of what I could do on a daily basis. About 8 years ago, I watched a film that changed me profoundly. I watched a documentary called Manufactured Landscapes, and it's a film which follows a Canadian photographer. His name is Edward Batinsky, as he travelled around taking photos of landscapes that had been changed by large-scale human activity. So taking photos of the world's largest dam and mining facilities and big rubbish dumps and the world's largest factories in China. And there's one overhead shot of a shipping port with just containers upon containers upon containers. And after watching that film, I decided that I never wanted to buy anything ever again. Shortly after that, Christmas rolled around in our house, and I sat down with my parents and had a conversation. I said to my dad, how would you feel if this Christmas, instead of buying each other stuff, because I'm pretty sure we've all got enough stuff, how would you feel if instead we bought each other experiences like a massage voucher, or we did homemade gifts or something along those lines? And my dad stopped for a moment and he said to me, or we could buy nothing at all. And I thought, in that moment, I just had so much respect for my dad. I thought he was a freaking genius. I was like, cool, let's do that. That sounds amazing. And so that's what we did that Christmas, and we've done it every Christmas since then. And it was just the best thing ever. Like, there was no stress trying to figure out what to buy people. There was no kind of financial pressure. We just enjoyed each other's company, had good food, and had fun. It was wonderful, and I highly recommend it. And then I became a mum, and that changes you quite a lot. You start to think about not just yourself, but what's going to happen for your child growing up. What kind of planet are they growing up on? And then I discovered a book about 4 years ago called Zero Waste Home by Bayer Johnson. I suddenly realised that I could take action on a daily basis, and I could change the way I live in a way that aligned with my ideals, and I suddenly felt very, very empowered. It's kind of roller coaster from there, I guess.
On your website, there's a Zero Waste Pledge, and what that means, the R's.
To help to avoid waste coming into our household, we try to follow the 6 R's. You'll find that some people say 5 R's, some say 6, some say 8. We have 6 in our house. The first one is to refusing the stuff that you don't need. Saying no to the straws, saying no to the plastic bags, no junk mail, no freebies, because every time you say yes to those things, every time you buy something or you accept something, you are creating a demand for more. So that's the first one. That's probably the most important one. The next one is to reduce. That is going through your house, looking at all the crap that you have accumulated in your life and thinking, which of these things do I actually use on a daily basis? Which of this stuff is useful to me? Which of these things are gathering dust and would be better served in a different household? So it's not treating your household like a landfill. So it's simplifying and decluttering, which is a hugely liberating experience. The next one is to reuse. For pretty much every disposable product you can think of, not all of them, but pretty much all of them, there is a money-saving and sustainable reusable alternative. In our household, we don't go to the supermarket very often these days. We go and we take our reusable bags and containers to the bulk store and we buy our food package free. So it's replacing those disposable products with reusable alternatives. The next one is repair, and that's probably one of the more challenging ones because a lot of the products we buy these days are deliberately designed to not be repaired. They don't want you to repair it, they want you to buy another one. So if you can repair it. Something to keep in mind when you do buy a thing. What's going to happen to this when it breaks? Can I fix it? Can I send it somewhere to be fixed? If not, maybe have a look and see what the alternatives are. Then we have recycle. So recycling has a role in the zero waste hierarchy, but you'll notice it's quite far down the hierarchy, and the reason for that is because recycling is a very energy-intensive and polluting process in itself. Not everything that you put into your recycling bin is going to be recycled. You've heard the stories of China shutting the doors and plastics stockpiling around the place. And a lot of the plastics that we do put into our recycling bins, much of it can't be recycled infinitely. It has a limited recycling life, and eventually will end up in landfill. It has a role, but It's certainly very, very far down in the hierarchy. And the last one is rot. Parul was speaking about how much of our waste in our rubbish bins is food waste. So food waste and green waste combined is 50% of our rubbish bin. So once you remove the food waste from your rubbish bin, you've effectively halved your waste. And a lot of people seem to think that it's okay to put your food waste into the landfill, it'll just rot away and be fine. It's actually not the case. It contributes methane. We are contributing to climate change with all of the food waste we put into our rubbish bins. Composting is ridiculously easy. I'm not a green-fingered person. You don't have to have green fingers to compost, but it's a really, really important part of the waste process.
So going from filling a bin every week to a standard of kind of zero waste can seem quite intimidating or challenging. What would be the simplest step that you can recommend people who want to make a change but don't think they can't just leap into zero waste straight away? What's a couple of simple steps that it's like, this is some stuff that would really make a difference?
In our household, we're a household of three. It's myself, my husband, and our 5-year-old daughter. And we used to throw away a standard size rubbish bin once a fortnight, I think it was. Not too bad, but these days it takes us probably about 2 years to fill a wheelie bin, so we have come quite a long way. We've been doing this for 4 years. It's a process, and that's something that you have to come to terms with. It won't happen overnight, but you have to make a start, and once you start, keep going, and you get better, and you get better, and you get better. The place that I started was, I just looked in our rubbish bin, and I thought, what are the biggest waste items in our household? And it's going to be different for different households, so I can't say one magic answer to this question. But for us, it was Tetra packs of soy milk and veggie stock. So I decided that I would start making those items at home myself. After that, I made a list. I went through every room of the house. I made a list of all of the consumable items that we purchase. And then I just slowly went through that list and tried to find alternatives. Many of the things on that list we went without altogether. You just have to start. And once you start, you'll feel motivated to keep going, basically. But realize that it'll take time.
Kristy actually runs a website called Earth Savvy.
And a lot of these things I wish had been around when I first started, because when I first started trying to find reusable products to help me reduce my waste, I had to go to a whole lot of different places. And it was quite expensive and time-consuming, so I just wanted to make that process easier for other people, I guess. One resource on my website, which you might find useful, I've put together a room-by-room guide, which basically swaps from disposable products to reusable alternatives, if you want to check that out.
So the first question that I will pluck out of the lot is, why can't you put food waste in the general bin?
I don't think we said you can't put food waste in the general bin, but it's a waste of resource. And I think you talked about it, there is a lot of food waste that goes into your general bin. It is a waste of resource. You can actually do much better with it. If it goes into landfill, there is greenhouse gases created from it.
Contrary to public opinion, food waste does not break down in landfill. Landfill acts as a tomb of sorts, I guess. There's no oxygen in landfill. And so it breaks down, but very, very slowly. And as it does break down, it's emitting methane. And that's a greenhouse gas, which is approximately 25% more powerful than carbon dioxide. So it's contributing to an environmental nightmare, basically.
Why doesn't composting produce the same methane problems?
I think it is at anaerobic and aerobic circumstance in terms of the way you do. So that's more a technical answer. I guess the other thing around food waste, what is your food waste comprising of? Is it vegetable peelings, or is it actually the food that was stuck in the fridge at the back, which you forgot to eat? Or is it got expiry date? So it's actually looking at, are we creating food waste which shouldn't be created in the first place? So is it avoidable food waste?
I think the simple answer was there is oxygen in a home compost. There's no oxygen in landfill.
How does an incinerator compare to composting?
We do have incinerators in Auckland, quite a few of them, and there is a limit to how much your wastewater treatment plant can take that organic material. Yes, you can put some of it in there, and that's what they are designed to do, but they do have an impact on the pipes that are underground and then going into the wastewater treatment plant. And they have an impact on the life of those plants as well. So that system is not designed for dealing with your food scraps. But if there's a little bit that you can put it in there and it kind of churns it out and sticks it in, you also need to think about the amount of water that you need to then put in to actually get it cleared. So I think just thinking about those elements.
I think, I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the scraps are collected up through that system and sent to landfill anyway. Is that correct? I'm pretty sure. So yeah, compost.
We have been recycling as a community for well over a decade now. Has any research been done on whether this has led to any significant reduction in per capita waste?
Definitely there has been reduction in per capita waste in terms of, if you think about everything was going in one bin earlier, so you are actually diverting that. There is a high level of, what I have seen, I've been in this country since 2003. I came in when we were introducing recycling in Rodney in crates. So what happened before recycling was introduced, everything did go into one bin or bag that went to landfill. So from that perspective, you are diverting that much. But there's a long way to go.
If we're not providing infrastructure for companies to use alternative packaging, places that can actually commercially compost the plastics that they might choose to use, nor demanding that they provide both the alternative packaging and processing, how can we expect any change? Isn't it the government's role to bargain with the collective bargaining power of the people they represent?
There's nobody from here from government.
I
yes. Guess the short answer is yes. Yes. And I think, as I was talking about onshore processing and having more investment put in by government as well for onshore processing of recyclables, it has to be national solutions. Because if you think about our country, we're not big enough to have like city-wide solutions. We need to have bigger plants which would take it from the nation. So definitely.
Yeah, I would just add to that as well to say that the issue that we do have in New Zealand is because we are so small in terms of the actual volumes that we produce of anything. I mean, I know we might think we've got stockpiles of materials, but in reality our volumes are actually really small. And so that investment is very challenging, to say the least. And so what we really do need to do, and I totally agree with Parul, is that we need to look on a national basis at what is it that we actually need in terms of infrastructure. What are we looking at from a national impact point of view? And that is a role for government to actually take some leadership in that space and say, well, what's the plan? And help actually develop, well, what is it we're trying to achieve in New Zealand? And then work backwards from there. Well, what is it that we need to do? What are the steps that we need to do in place? What are the limitations that we have to take into account? And then that will lead us then to actually look at, well, what solutions have we got? What solutions can we develop? Actually, where do we need to partner? And that partnership might be outside of New Zealand. It might be, how do we look at an Australasian facility? What does all of this look like? We're not having those conversations. We're not talking about what we need to do nationally. And so government actually does have a pot of money in terms of our waste minimisation fund. And so there is an opportunity there to say, well, what could we be doing with that money? What sort of national infrastructure do we actually need? And we're not having those conversations.
I would also argue that I think we really need to step away from our disposable habits. I agreed with what you said earlier, that we could possibly be replacing one problem with another. And a lot of these products that we're talking about, you don't need to use a single-use item. You can use a reusable one instead.
How is the national sword affecting your business now and in the long term?
So national sword is the China situation, basically. So national sword is what China called shutting up shop. So when they said that they were going to do no more, then that's what national sword is called. National sword is actually the result of the green fence. So prior to national sword, China had what was called a green fence. So basically they have been signalling for several years now that they are going to tighten up on what they are importing, and basically the world just simply took no notice and carried on shipping all of the stuff to it, and didn't actually take heed of the fact that they were signalling quite some time ago that the quality was going one way and that wasn't up. And so national sword is actually where they did go, that's it, no more. And so that's what national sword is. But in terms of the impact of it, I mean the impacts have been global. To be fair, it's not just a New Zealand impact. The impacts have been global, and the result is that we have to find solutions that are closer to home. And I say closer to home because if we go back into the New Zealand context, it might not be appropriate for those solutions to be here in New Zealand. We just don't have the volumes to perhaps warrant the sorts of investment that are needed. We might have to take material to an intermediary stage and then it goes somewhere else for final processing. So those are the sorts of options that are things that we have to, we again, go back to what I said previously, we actually have to have a conversation about. We actually have to understand what it is that we're trying to achieve here in New Zealand and what can we do, how can we achieve it. But the effects have been quite profound, again, globally, because it's made everybody sit up and take some notice. And we are seeing in my area, in the packaged goods, the fast-moving consumer goods space, then we are seeing that the biggest companies in the world are looking at, well, you know what, we're going to have to be doing things differently. So there is a real collective energy to see things be done differently. I would just add one issue here that I'm quite passionate about, which is managing the expectations, because the reality of our fast-moving consumer good chains are they're not easy things to turn around overnight. You know, there's massive amounts of plant and equipment that are geared up to do things and do things really, really efficiently. And so to actually turn those around overnight is not a simple task. So whilst big pledges and commitments and certainly a lot of energy is going into looking at how we do things differently, it's not an overnight process either.
Speaking of overnight processes, banning bags in the supermarkets. Are the reusable bags that were being sold at the supermarkets actually a better option? I don't think they're recyclable at the end of their life, and they're much bigger than soft plastic bags in landfill.
I think that the plastic bag debate has been a bit of a distraction in some regards. I think even our messages coming out of government really quite clearly understood that the impact of banning single-use plastic shopping bags was never going to be all that great. I mean, in their own discussion paper, I think it was 0.01% of landfill. You know, the impact is not great. What it has done is open up a conversation, and it has got people engaged, and it has got people talking about it. But again, the alternatives, generally speaking, are probably worse than what the original plastic bag was, in terms of the amount of material, in terms of looking at how often you have to use these things. But that's not to say that we shouldn't have been having the conversation, because if it gets people thinking about these things, these bags were always discretionary items. You never had to take them. So you always had an option. And now, if that option's taken away, well, then you're actually forced to do something differently. In terms of swapping one material for another, has that had a great impact overall? Life cycle analysis and all the rest would tell you probably not. But nevertheless, in terms of getting people thinking about it, in terms of getting people looking at what they could do, then it's been a good thing.
Plastic bags are a really good place to start, whether you view them as a distraction or not. I don't think it matters too much. It's a product that we don't need, and it's a start, and it gets people thinking about their impact and what are the things they can do on a daily basis, and it's a really simple one to start with. The bags that you get from your supermarkets, they are made of plastic, most of them, so they're not a great option. They are recyclable through the soft plastic recycling scheme, although that soft plastic is being stockpiled at the moment. Yeah, so not a great option. We're creating too much soft plastic, so it's being stockpiled. There have been a couple of kind of scaremongering articles and stuff in the New Zealand Herald talking about the impact of the various alternatives to plastic bags and saying, oh, well, you've got to use your reusable bag 150 times before it's a viable alternative. Well, I can guarantee the bags I've had are going to last much longer than that, so I don't think that's an issue. I think you have to educate people what are the best materials to use Certainly, things like cotton have a huge impact in terms of the environment, but looking at things like jute, hemp, why are we not exploring hemp more? I don't know. Secondhand materials, making your own bags, kete. There are so many alternatives. You don't need a plastic bag. Do your research.
A couple of questions refer to plans where they burn soft plastics to produce electricity. So Germany burns rubbish to produce 50% of their electricity. Why don't we?
I guess the philosophy that Auckland has as well, and I think you've got the same philosophy in terms of zero waste, and that actually talks about a circular economy rather than a linear one. So why do you want to create a product, or why do you want to create a plant that has to be fed continuously with waste that's being created? If you look at what's happened in Sweden as well, their waste-to-energy plant is so big, they have to get waste from other areas to feed it. So how smart is that? So I'm just thinking, it's actually at the bottom of the hierarchy that you talked about earlier. Waste-to-energy, yes, if you've got something left after doing the 6, 7, 8 hours, then if you've got something left and you can produce some energy from it more efficiently than putting it in the landfill, then yes. But if you want to create a plant that's just going to be fed with something that has to be created all the time rather than reduced, then maybe not.
I think the cost of creating those plants is astronomical, and so once you've created that plant, then you have to justify its continued use. And so you're not encouraging people to reduce their waste, so I don't see it as a viable option.
I think it's a question that we actually need to have a grown-up conversation about. And that's not to say I'm preempting any outcomes of that. I think it is something that we clearly have got material that we will not be able to do anything with. Now, we have to have a decision as a country as to, well, what's our better option here? So if you take what, as an extreme case of what we've been shipping off to China and other places, and they just take out what they want and dump the rest in the ocean, well, would waste to energy have been a better option? And I'm not to say that's a conversation that I think we need to have. Like I say, I'm not preempting any outcomes, but I do think we should have a grown-up conversation about it. Yes, there is no question that those early waste-to-energy plants in Europe, where it's a lot more widespread, were and are beasts that need feeding. But the technology, like all technology, has moved on tremendously, and plants can be scaled. And they are pretty efficient nowadays and do not have to be beasts. So I'm not saying that it is the answer, and there is absolutely no question that it is material then that's out of circulation, but it has created energy. Is that a good thing? I think we need to have a conversation.
I think when we're talking about waste, it's very easy just to focus on what you're putting in your rubbish bin, what you're putting in your recycling bin, and not often do we actually think about the whole process. The mining of non-renewable resources, the pollution that results from the transport of those resources, the manufacture, the transport to get them to landfill. It's the whole process, it's the whole picture that we need to look at. So it's not just, oh dear, I'm not going to make any rubbish. And so once you create those plants, you have to continue feeding them. I don't think it's a way forward.
Do we send any plastic to China anymore, and how was it contaminated?
No, we don't send any plastics to China anymore. There are other markets in Asia that is getting the material. How is it contaminated? Because you have a bin that's actually commingled, and then when you get it to the MRF, it may have bits of other bits in it when you're sorting it out. So you've got materials that might be mixed in it, but also it could be dirty because people haven't rinsed out the product completely as well. So those are the key elements.
The other key element of contamination when they talk about it in plastics is that basically all plastics aren't the same. So you don't, glass is glass. Aluminium is aluminium. But all plastic is not the same. So your wee triangles that are on the bottom of your plastics that have got the numbers in them, those numbers are not recycling symbols, in case anybody's in any doubt here. What those numbers mean is they are actually identifying the resin type. So if you've got a number 1, that means it's PET. If you've got a number 2, it's HDPE. If you've got a number 3, it's PVC. If you've got a number 4, it's LDPE. Number 5 is polypropylene. Number 6 is polystyrene. And so basically what the contamination means is if you mix all of those plastics together, then there is no separating it. That's not true. You can separate it, and we do. Our MRFs actually pull out plastics 1 and 2, so they can actually take out those because they're quite valuable. But I'm sure I'm right. The 3s through to 7s are all mixed together. So mixed plastics are contaminated plastics because basically the properties of polystyrene are different to the properties of polypropylene. And so you can't mix the two together. So unless you can actually separate those, then if they mingle together, they're contaminated.
I think it depends on what markets you're approaching. So we do have a market for mixed plastics as well. It does not fetch as good a commodity price as the others might do. But yeah, contamination is that level of clean product.
Do you know what the ratio in our recycling bins are of like what can actually be sold as commodities versus what actually just gets put in waste because nothing can be done with it?
Hell yeah. So what I would call as contamination is about 12% of your bin by weight is contamination, which means people putting wrong items in the recycling. Could be a pig's head, could be clothing, a dead cat, a whole toilet bowl. So there's a lot. Also, you can get saucepans, pans, china dishes. People think that's glass, but that's not really recyclable in the curbside. I don't know if you knew. So what is recyclable in your curbside is basically packaging products or containers that come out of your kitchen, laundry, or your bathroom, and paper and card. So glass from any other, your wine glass, doesn't really go in there. So, that's contamination, and that's about 12% in Auckland.
Kristy, how do you make soy milk?
I had a few experiments with my soy milk making. My daughter did not really appreciate the first few experiments, but I've got a recipe that's pretty bang on now. It's basically, I get New Zealand soybeans. I'm not sure whereabouts in New Zealand they're grown, but they're New Zealand. From the bulk store, I fill up a big pot of water and get it boiling, and I throw the soybeans in there and cook them for a few minutes. I cool them, and then I drain the liquid, and I put a cup of the soybeans into a blender with 3 cups of water, blend it all up. I strain it through some cheesecloth. I chuck it in the freezer because it lasts much longer, and I usually do about a fortnight's worth at a time.
My friend told me that steel is removed from landfill waste with magnets. Is that true?
Not from landfill, but during the recycling process, it will be separated. Is that what you mean?
Steel?
Yeah. And infinitely recyclable, so good material.
Could someone give a sense of what happens to soft plastics recycling in New Zealand? They've got the big barrels at the supermarket.
Yeah.
Anything that can be scrunched, put it in here. What's the deal with that?
So it was, until very recently, being sent to Australia, and it was being recycled into plastic lumber and furniture, basically. And unfortunately, we're creating too much of it, and so they've put the brakes on that and said we can't accept anymore. And so they are stockpiling it at the moment, and they are looking for a place in New Zealand to recycle it, apparently. But, one of the problems with that recycling system is that they are recycled into non-recyclable products, so eventually they will end up in landfill at some point along the line.
I guess the other end of it is how many of us are buying that furniture. So you need to create the demand for the product as well that it's getting recycled into. Otherwise, it's just going to sit there.
I think one of the other issues is back to this issue of contamination. So if you look at soft plastics, the definition of going into that scheme was scrunchable. If it's scrunchable plastic, well, your idea of scrunchable and mine might be 2 different things. So it's not really a very technical way of giving people instructions. The facts are that the material, again, is very contaminated because it is different types of film plastic is one of the, it's quite a technical marvel, but it's also particularly difficult to recycle because it's, generally speaking, made up of laminated layers, often containing foil, And so those layers are virtually impossible to separate. And once you start to get foil into the system, well, then it just makes it virtually unrecyclable. So yes, there was the opportunity to downcycle it into furniture, and absolutely, there's only a limited market for that sort of thing. So it's again, well, what do we do with that? Simplify the system so that it's just taking plastic shopping bags and bread bags. So you're looking at the same material, and then you've got the ability to do something with it. But the minute you actually put everything in together, well, then you're then reliant on markets that can take that mixed material and do something with it. And generally speaking, that involves putting it into things like wooden alternatives, and even those are a bit difficult with the foil in there, but certainly park benches and the like. But how many park benches do we actually need?
There are companies that are coming up with other ideas. I don't know if you've heard of EnviroPlus, that's looking at putting plastic in concrete. So there are people who are thinking outside the square and going, okay, plastic is a problem. How do we deal with it of what's been already created? I mean, the ideal would be let's not create it in the first place, then to have to deal with it. But if it is there, but then you need to make sure that product has no environmental impacts. You're putting it in concrete. Is it leaching into the environment or not? So other questions. But there is innovation that's happening in that space. In terms of plastics, there's another company that's looking at oil production from it as well. Again, just need to be careful of the environmental impacts.
What happens to, like, you've got a commercial green waste bin, like, where do they take that and what do they do with it?
So there are quite a few companies that will collect your green waste and compost it and make it into a product. So legit companies.
The other one is fibre recycling, so clothing, cloth. What exists in New Zealand to be able to recycle or to reuse clothes or sheets or the other material that has come to the end of its life with you? I
am aware of a company that was looking into it. There is a lot of fabric or clothing going into landfill at the moment. There are others where you've got the clothing bins, so before you can actually put it to that end of its life, there are other ways of actually reusing or other elements to it. But I'm not aware of a lot happening in terms of the recycling element of it. And it also depends on what your products are made out of.
Is clothing waste a big issue? And I guess you've just sort of said that, there's a lot of it going into landfill.
It's all the fast fashion as well.
Is there a hope that there's going to be able to recycle, or is it the fact, basically one of the things that comes to mind is the fact that I was listening to a podcast a while ago that was talking about the fact that they used to take old jeans and create money in America. So all the American money is made of fabric, but the problem is now they can't actually find enough jeans that are just cotton because all the jeans have stretch in them. We all need stretch. Kristy, the second half of that question is for you. How do you think we should change with our clothing waste, and what can we do about it?
I'm not prone to anxiety attacks. I had one about, I think it was last year. I went clothes shopping and I had a list. And my list was, okay, I'm going to go to op shops and I'm going to look for natural fabrics. And that didn't go very well. And I ended up in a retail store surrounded by new clothes, and I suddenly visualized, I'm not sure if you realize this, but all of the items, all of the products in stores arrive in that store individually packaged in plastic. Regardless of what you see on the store shelf, it's all individually wrapped in soft plastic. And so I bought some natural fabrics, and that was okay. And I went home, and then I had a bra which was, had it. And I said to my husband, I said, "What am I going to do with this? This is going to landfill, isn't it?" And he said, "I don't know what to do." And I had a bit of a breakdown, to be honest. So what was the question, sorry?
The question was, how do we do clothing better?
Okay, so avoid synthetic fabrics. They're everywhere, but you need to avoid them because every time you put them in the washing machine, microplastics are disappearing down the washing machine and into our waterways and into our oceans. So natural fabrics are what you are looking for: wool, cotton, silk, linen. Avoid polyester. It's terrible stuff.
What can we actually do as individuals in the face of such large problems, and how do you sort of take, what do you do to take solace in what you can do?
If you were Prime Minister, what would you change? There's a lot of Prime Minister theme going on. And my answer was I would make people realize how powerful they are. As individuals, we are incredibly powerful. We look to governments, we look to corporations, we think, oh, we're just little people, we can't do anything, you solve all of our problems. Every great movement in human history has started with one person, and then that one person has spoken to someone else, who's spoken to someone else, who's spoken to someone else, and the movement has grown. And I want people to realize how powerful they are. And don't feel alone, because there are lots of other people who feel exactly the same way as you. There are lots of other people who are horrified at what we're doing to this planet. I started the Zero Waste in NZ Facebook group a couple of years ago. It's grown to over 20,000 people now. So there are people out there who will support you. And if you're feeling lost, I recommend that you connect with your community and you seek solace there and realize that I think that most people want to do the right thing. And when they're provided with the education and they're shown the tools, they will make changes to their lifestyle. And I think that we need to have faith that of the good in people, and talk to as many people as you possibly can about these issues, because they're really, really important. Really important. Really important. Really important. Really important.